Okay, another way to do factoring is to use what we call the box method. And I know that many of you can just figure out how to factor these two, but the box method may come in handy when we start dealing with numbers that are with the x squared that are not 1. Okay, so the box method is similar to a method you had already been doing. Your first step is to factor out the greatest common factor from each term. There, seeing none in number 1, we then just draw our box. So we have our box. We have to put in some numbers, so we take the leading coefficient, the 1 in the variable 1x squared. We take the 4 and we put the 4 in there. Now you want to take these two that you just wrote in and you multiply them. So you're going to have 1x squared times 4, which is 4x squared. You now need to think about what are your factors and what are your sums that you're going to use. Well, you're going to use this 4x squared that you came up with for your factors, and your sum is going to come from your middle term, which is 5x. So we have to think about what factors are there for 4x squared. Well, we could have 2 times 2, we could have 4 times 1, or you could have 1 times 4, which is the same. And we want to get 5x. Well, 2 plus 2 is 4, so that's not what we want. 4 plus 1 is 5, so we know that then that one would work. And it doesn't matter what order you use, 1 and 4 or 4 and 1, you now want to place them into here in your box. But you need to make sure you put the variable with them. Okay. The next step when doing the box method is essentially to find the GCF of each row in each column. So the GCF of this first row here of 1x squared and 1x is just 1x. The GCF of 4x and 4 is 4. Okay, now do your vertical columns. 1x squared and 4x, the GCF is x, and x and 4, the GCF is just 1. So now take those two binomials you just found and we write them as our final answer, x plus 1 times x plus 4. And you can do your check, so you get your x squared with your first, your outers gives you 4x, your inners gives you 1x, and your last gives you 4. So which will give you your 1x squared plus 5x plus 4. Okay, so let's try example number 2. Example number 2, you find out is there a GCF. Seeing none, we go right to the rectangle or the box method, whichever way you want to call it. We put in the x squared and the negative 14. The sign goes with it. We multiply these two, so we get negative 14x squared for our factors. And our sum needs to be 5x. So our factors of negative 14. Well, negative 7 and positive 2 will give you negative 5. Not the number we want, but close. If I do 2 and negative 7, I end up with negative 5. If I do negative 2 and positive 7, sorry, I repeated up there, I end up getting positive 5, which is what I want. So I take each of these numbers and I have to put them into one of the open spots and take the sign with it. So I have negative 2 and I put an x, and then I have 7 and x, because 7x times 2x, negative 2x gives me negative 14x squared. So now I have to go across row and column, so I end up doing my x squared plus 7x, or excuse me, my x squared and 7x, which will give you a GCF of x. Negative 2x and negative 14 would end up having negative 2. You want to keep the sign of the part of the rectangle that is closest to where you're coming out of. Okay, do the vertical greatest common factor, which would be x, and the next vertical greatest common factor would be positive 7. So we end up with x plus 7 and x minus 2 when we take our two numbers that were outside the box. Okay, so we can do the check. We get x squared, we get negative 2x plus 7x is 5x, and 7 times negative 2 is negative 14. Okay, so why don't you try these ones? Okay, so x squared minus 7x minus 30. There's no greatest common factor. So let's draw a box. First number that goes in is your x squared. The next number is negative 30. So we need to find the factors in the sum. The factors need to be negative 30 and the sum needs to be negative 7x. Okay, so start thinking of your factors of negative 30. So we could have negative 5 and 6, which would give you 1, or negative 6 and 5, which would give you negative 1. So think of some more. 1 and 30, and one of them has to be negative. That gives you 29. If the other were negative, that would give you negative 29. What else goes into 30? How about 3 and 10 and making the 3 negative? Well, that will give you positive 7, which is not what you want, but close. So make the negative 10 and positive 3 would give you negative 7. So we now take that last one I just found and put it in. So we're going to have negative 10x and we're going to have 3x here. Now you want to find the greatest common factor going across and then going up and down. Now going across, you can go across in either direction. So x squared and 3x, we end up with an x. Negative 10x and negative 30, we end up with negative 10. Going up, we end up with x, and going up again, we end up with a positive 3. So we have x plus 3 times x minus 10, and we can do the check, where we do x times x is x squared. This will give us negative 10x plus 3 will give you negative 7, and then 3 times negative 10 is negative 30. Okay, number 4, is there a GCF? No, there isn't one, so jump right to your rectangle. When you jump right to your rectangle, you're going to end up having your x squared here and your positive 75. You multiply them, you have to come up with the factors of 75 and the sum of negative 28. So 75 breaks down to 1 and 75. Well, that's not going to get you it, it's going to give you 76. If they're both negative, it's still going to give you negative 76. Can't put 2 in. Could do 3 with 25, and if I make the 25 negative and the 3 negative, I end up getting negative 28. So now I take those two numbers and I put them into the box. I have negative 3 with an x and negative 25 with an x. Okay, find your greatest common factor by going across and then up and down. So x squared and negative 25x would be x. Negative 3x and 75 would be 3, and keep its sign of this number closest. Going vertically, we would have x squared and negative 3x. X would be the greatest common factor. Negative 25x and 75. Negative 25 would be the greatest common factor. So we have x minus 25 times x minus 3 as our final answer. Okay, so what happens if that... Okay, so now your first number is not a 1, it's a different number. So it's going to take a little more work for yourself to actually figure out the factors. So find out if there's a GCF, and if you look at number 1, there's no GCF. So we jump right into the rectangle. When we jump right into the rectangle, remember you're going to put your first set here, 2x squared, and your constant of 5 here. So now we have to multiply 2x squared and 5, and we end up with 10x squared. So that's where you want to actually find your factors of our 10x squared. So your factors of 10 could be 1 and 10. So we could have 1 and 10, but the sum of those is going to give 11. We could do 5 and 2, which would give you a sum of 7. And look at that. That's what you actually want to have. So you take this 5 and you put it in, and it's 5 times x. You take the 2 and you put it in, and it's 2x. So now we need to find the greatest common factor going across. So going to the left, the greatest common factor between these two numbers would be x. The greatest common factor from 2x and 5 would be 1. Okay, 2x squared and 2x, the greatest common factor would be 2x, and the greatest common factor for 5x and 5 would be 5. Okay, and this is a positive and this is a positive, so when we write our answer of x plus 1 times 2x plus 5, we can end up having our 5x here, our 2x gives us 7x. we're going to have 2x squared, and we're going to have 5, and then this would be our final answer. So 3x squared, minus 11x minus 4. You want to make sure that you end up seeing if a GCF can come out. Seeing none, we do our rectangle. And it doesn't have to be perfectly drawn, but we have 3x squared. We have negative 4. We multiply those two, so we end up with negative 12x squared. So we have to think of the factors of negative 12x squared that will give you a sum of negative 11. So 12, so factors of 12. Factors of 12 could be 6 and 2, which when you add them gives you 8, even with a negative. If they're both negatives, and that's not going to give you a negative 12x squared, so you may have to do negative 6 times positive 2, which would give you negative 4. Okay, so still we don't have enough, so we need to keep going. So think of other factors of negative 12. So we have 4 and negative 3 would give us negative 1. Negative 4 and positive 3 would give us negative 1. Oops, this is positive 1. Okay, so what other factors are there? We have factors of 12 and 1 itself. So we could have negative, which gives us negative 11. Okay, which remember you wanted to get negative 11. So we're done. We found our factors. Okay, so now we put in our negative 12, comma 1. So negative 12 with an x and 1 with an x. Okay, we do our GCF from both rows and columns. So 3x squared and 1x is x. Negative 12x and minus 4 gives you negative 4. 3x squared and negative 12x gives you 3x, and 1x and 4 gives you plus 1. So your answer is going to be x minus 4 times 3x plus 1. You can do your check. This will give you your negative 12x plus your 1 gives you negative 11. This gives you negative 3x squared, and this gives you your negative 4. Okay, so the box method may not be the only method that you know or that you feel comfortable with, but it's just another technique for doing factoring.